The stagecoach lurched violently to the left, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against a hidden rock buried deep within the freezing mud of the trail. Inside the cramped, musty cabin, Eleanor Vance gasped, her gloved hands gripping the frayed leather strap hanging from the ceiling until her knuckles turned white. She was the only passenger left. The others, a rough-looking miner with a hacking cough and a silent woman clutching a Bible, had disembarked 2 towns back, leaving Eleanor alone with her terrifying thoughts and the encroaching silence of the wilderness. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, carrying with it the biting promise of a snowstorm that the driver had been cursing since they crossed the territorial line. Eleanor pressed her face against the cold glass of the window, trying to see through the grime and the gathering dusk. There was nothing but endless, imposing pine trees, standing like dark sentinels guarding secrets she wasn't meant to know. She looked down at her dress. It was a deep navy wool tailored in Paris, the height of fashion for a stroll through Central Park or a tea service in a Manhattan parlor. Here, in the savage heart of the Rockies, it was ridiculous. The hem was already ruined, stained with travel grease and mud, and the fabric, though expensive, offered little protection against the chill that seemed to seep through the carriage walls. "Silver Creek," the driver bellowed from above, his voice muffled by the wind. "Last stop, everybody out." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line, the place on the map where she had decided her old life would die and a new, invisible one would begin. She checked her reflection in the small, compact mirror she kept in her reticule. Her face was pale, drawn with dark circles under eyes that had once sparkled at balls and galas. She pinched her cheeks, trying to bring some color back, trying to look like a woman of fortitude rather than a fugitive fleeing a scandal that wasn't even her fault. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and opened the carriage door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of freezing air that sucked the breath from her lungs. She stepped down, her delicate boots sinking immediately into the slurry of half-frozen mud that constituted the main street of Silver Creek. The town was not the picturesque hamlet the brochures in Denver had promised. It was a scar on the landscape, a haphazard collection of grey, weathered timber buildings that looked as if they were leaning away from the wind in fear. The air smelled of wood smoke, raw sewage, and unwashed bodies. The driver unceremoniously dumped her trunk onto the wooden boardwalk. It was a heavy, leather-bound trunk with brass fittings, another remnant of her wealthy past that screamed, "Outsider." "Be quick about your business, miss," the driver grunted, climbing back onto his perch. "Storm's coming hard tonight. Don't want to be caught out here." With a crack of his whip, the coach rattled away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the fading light. She looked around. The street was largely empty, save for a few men lingering in front of a saloon, their eyes hidden beneath the brims of tattered hats. They stopped talking as she watched them, their gazes heavy and predatory, tracking her like wolves spotting a wounded deer. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, lifting her chin in a reflex of defiance she had learned from her grandmother. She needed lodging. She needed a job. She needed to disappear. She dragged her trunk toward the largest building on the street, which bore a peeling sign that read, "Silver Creek Inn and Boarding." The wood of the porch creaked ominously under her feet as she ascended the stairs. Inside, the warmth was a welcome relief, though the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and frying grease. A large woman with a face like a dried apple stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with a rag that looked greasier than the floor. "I need a room," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound authoritative. "For a month, perhaps longer." The woman stopped wiping the glass. She looked Eleanor up and down, her eyes narrowing as they took in the expensive cut of the coat, the quality of the leather gloves, and the desperate exhaustion in Eleanor's eyes. In a town like Silver Creek, a woman arriving alone with expensive luggage meant only one of two things. She was a prostitute looking to set up shop, or she was running from the law. To Mrs. Higgins, the innkeeper, both were equally sinful. "We're full," the woman said flatly, turning her back to place the glass on a shelf. Eleanor blinked. "Full? But I saw no other passengers get off the coach. The town seems quiet. Surely you have one room. I can pay." She reached for her purse, eager to show the silver dollars she had hoarded, the last of her inheritance that hadn't been seized by her fiancé's creditors. I said we're full, Mrs. Higgins repeated, turning around with a scowl. We don't take your kind here. My kind? Eleanor asked, confusion warring with indignation. I am a seamstress, a teacher. I am simply looking for a quiet place to live. A seamstress in silk and kid-skin boots? The woman let out a harsh, barking laugh that drew the attention of the few patrons in the dining area. Honey, I know a high-priced fancy woman when I see one. You bring trouble. You bring men fighting and drinking and sinning. Silver Creek is a God-fearing town mostly. We don't need the likes of you bringing the devil to our doorsteps. Try the saloon down the street. Maybe they have a bed for you above the bar. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth of her sheltered, pious upbringing, that she couldn't speak. She had fled New York because her fiancé, a man she thought she loved, had embezzled thousands from his firm and framed her for the transfer of funds. She was innocent, but the newspapers had branded her a thief and a temptress. She had come here to escape that reputation, only to find it waiting for her in the prejudice of a stranger's eyes. I am not a... Eleanor couldn't even say the word. She grabbed the handle of her trunk. Fine. If there is another boarding house, I shall go there. Ain't no other boarding house. A voice came from a corner table. An older man with a grey beard was watching her, not with malice, but with a grim pity. Mrs. Higgins is the only beds in town, miss, unless you want to sleep in the livery stable with the horses. Eleanor looked back at the innkeeper, hoping for a shred of mercy. Mrs. Higgins crossed her arms over her chest, her face set in stone. Get out. Eleanor turned and fled, dragging the heavy trunk back out into the biting wind. The temperature had dropped significantly in just the few minutes she had been inside. The sun was gone now, replaced by a heavy, oppressive grey twilight. Snow had begun to fall, large wet flakes that clung to her eyelashes and melted against her feverish skin. She stood on the boardwalk, panic rising in her throat like bile. She couldn't sleep in the street. She would freeze to death before morning. She walked down the street, asking at the general store, the blacksmith, even the saloon. The answers were all the same. The men leered and made suggestions that made her stomach turn. The few women she encountered pulled their children away and crossed the street to avoid her. The gossip had spread faster than the wind. The fallen woman from the city was in town. No one wanted to be seen helping her. Finally, the old man from the inn found her sitting on her trunk, near the edge of town, shivering so violently her teeth chattered. Look, miss, he said, keeping a respectful distance. Folks here, they're wary of strangers, especially pretty ones with money written on them. They think you bring bad luck. I have nowhere to go, Eleanor stammered, her lips blue. There's the Miller shack, the man mumbled, pointing a gnarled finger toward the outskirts of the settlement, where the forest began to consume the cleared land. Old Miller died last winter. It's abandoned. Roof leaks and the door don't shut right, but it's got 4 walls and a stove. Nobody owns it now. You could squat there for the night. It wasn't an offer of hospitality, but it was a lifeline. Thank you, she whispered. The walk to the Miller shack was a nightmare. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the ground, making the mud slippery and treacherous. Eleanor had to drag the heavy trunk through the sludge, her arms screaming in agony, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally saw the structure, tears of despair froze on her cheeks. It was barely a house. It was a rotting carcass of timber, leaning precariously to one side. The windows were covered with oiled paper that had torn, flapping in the wind. Weeds grew up through the cracks in the porch. It looked like a place where hope went to die, but it was shelter. Eleanor shoved the door open. It scraped loudly against the warped floorboards. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled of mildew and rodents. She fumbled in her bag for a match and lit the single kerosene lantern she had brought. The dim, flickering yellow light revealed a single room. There was a rusted iron stove in the corner, a broken table, and a wooden frame that must have once been a bed, now stripped bare. She was safe from the wind, but the cold was still there, a living presence in the room. She dropped to her knees in front of the stove, opening the iron door. It was empty. Cold ash fluttered out. She looked around the room frantically. There was no wood, not a stick. The previous owner had burned everything before he died. Eleanor sat back on her heels, the realization crushing her. She had shelter, but without fire, in this temperature, the shelter was just a coffin. She stood up, her legs trembling, and looked out the gap in the door toward the dark, looming forest. The trees were massive, ancient things that blocked out the sky. Somewhere out there was wood, fallen branches, anything. She knew logically that a city girl with no experience should not wander into the woods at night during a snowstorm, but the alternative was to sit in the dark and let the frost stop her heart. She was Eleanor Vance. She had survived the scandal, the press, the loss of her family, the journey across the country. She would not let a little snow kill her. She opened her trunk and pulled out the only practical thing she owned, a heavy wool blanket. She wrapped it around herself like a cloak, grabbed the lantern, and stepped back out into the night. The wind tried to extinguish her light immediately, but she shielded it with her body, moving toward the tree line. What Eleanor didn't know, as she stepped into the shadows of the pines, was that the forest wasn't empty. High up on the ridge, overlooking the miserable town, eyes were watching. They weren't the eyes of a wolf or a bear, though the locals confused him with both. They were the eyes of a man who had turned his back on humanity, a man whose silence was heavier than the stone of the mountains, and he was watching the tiny, foolish light bobbing toward his domain. The silence of the forest was different from the silence of the city. In New York, silence was just a pause between noises, a breath before the next carriage passed or the next steam whistle blew. Here, the silence was aggressive. It was a weight that pressed against Eleanor's eardrums, broken only by the crunch of her boots on the snow-crusted underbrush and the rhythmic, terrifying howling of the wind through the upper branches of the pines. Eleanor had ventured only 100 yards into the tree line, but the town of Silver Creek had already vanished, swallowed by the darkness and the intensifying snowfall. She held the lantern high, her arm shaking uncontrollably. The light cast long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping skeletal hands. "Just a few branches," she whispered to herself, her voice sounding tiny and pathetic in the vastness. "Just enough to survive the night." She found a fallen limb, heavy and sodden with moisture. She bent to pick it up, the rough bark tearing at her expensive gloves. It was heavier than she expected. She dragged it a few feet, then stopped, gasping. She needed dry wood, not this wet rot that would only smoke and hiss. She pushed deeper, driven by a primal fear that was slowly overriding her common sense. The cold was no longer just painful, it was becoming numbing. Her toes felt like blocks of wood in her boots. Her fingers were stiffening around the lantern handle. She stumbled over a root and fell hard, the lantern skittering away, but miraculously staying lit. She lay in the snow for a moment, the desire to just close her eyes and sleep washing over her like a warm wave. It would be so easy. Just sleep. No. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself up. As she did, she heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, deep thud. 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 It was the sound of metal striking wood with immense power. Hope flared in her chest. Someone was out here. A logger. A hunter. Surely they would have a fire. They would help her. She grabbed the lantern and moved toward the sound, abandoning her path back to the shack. The sound grew louder, vibrating in the ground beneath her feet. She pushed through a dense thicket of spruce and stumbled into a small clearing. What she saw made her freeze, her breath catching in her throat. In the center of the clearing, illuminated by the moonlight reflecting off the snow, was a man. But calling him a man seemed inadequate. He was a giant. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the moon. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat that made him look even larger, and his head was bare to the freezing elements, revealing a mane of wild, dark hair and a thick beard that obscured most of his face. He was swinging a double-bitted axe with one hand, a tool that most men would need 2 hands to wield, splitting massive logs as if they were kindling. The power in his motion was terrifyingly efficient. Thwack, crack. The wood exploded apart. Eleanor stood paralyzed. She had heard the whispers in the general store earlier, hushed tones about the bear of Blackwood Ridge, a hermit who crushed stones with his bare hands and hated strangers. She had thought they were fairy tales to scare children. Now, staring at the mountain of a man before her, She realized the stories might have been understatements. She stepped backward, a twig snapping loudly under her heel. The chopping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. The giant turned slowly. He didn't spin around with surprise. He moved with the deliberate, predatory grace of an apex predator. His eyes found her immediately. Even across the clearing, in the gloom, she felt the impact of his gaze. It was intense, dark, and utterly unreadable. He stood there, the axe resting casually in one massive hand, staring at the shivering woman in the silk dress holding a lantern. He didn't speak. He didn't shout, "Who goes there?" He just watched. I... Eleanor's voice failed her. She tried to step back again, but her frozen legs betrayed her. The world tilted. The exhaustion, the cold, and the sheer terror of the moment combined to overwhelm her senses. The lantern slipped from her fingers, the glass shattering in the snow, and darkness rushed up to meet her. Consciousness returned to Eleanor in waves of pain. The first thing she felt was the stinging sensation in her hands and feet, the agony of blood returning to frozen limbs. The second thing she noticed was the smell. It didn't smell like the mildew of the shack. It smelled of pine resin, clean sweat, and dry heat. She gasped and sat up, her heart racing. She was not in the snow. She was wrapped in a rough, scratchy woolen blanket, sitting on the porch of the Miller shack. The door to the shack was slightly ajar, and a warm orange glow was spilling out. Confused and frightened, she scrambled to her feet, clutching the blanket. Had she dreamt it? Had she hallucinated the giant in the woods? She pushed the door open and stopped dead. The rusted iron stove, which had been cold and empty an hour ago, was now roaring with a fire so hot the metal sides were glowing cherry red. But that wasn't all. Stacked against the far wall, floor to ceiling, was a pile of firewood, perfectly split, dry, seasoned hardwood, enough wood to last a month. On the rickety table sat a burlap sack. Eleanor approached it cautiously, as if it might bite. She opened it. Inside were potatoes, a slab of cured venison, a bag of coffee beans, and a small tin of lard. It was a fortune in food, enough to keep a person alive through the worst of winter. She spun around, rushing back to the porch. The snow was falling heavily now, covering everything in a white shroud. But there, leading away from the shack and disappearing into the darkness of the forest, were footprints. They were massive, deep depressions in the snow, spaced widely apart, indicating a stride of immense length. He had been here. He had carried her back. Eleanor touched her face, her fingers trembling. Why hadn't he killed her? Why hadn't he robbed her? The townspeople treated her like a leper for wearing a nice dress, yet the monster of the mountain, the beast everyone feared, had saved her life and stocked her larder without saying a single word. The next morning, the sun broke through the grey clouds, illuminating a world buried in white. Eleanor woke up warm for the first time in weeks. The fire was still crackling. The logs the giant had left were oak, slow-burning and hot. She made coffee using snow she melted on the stove, the smell of the brewing beans making the shack feel slightly less like a grave. She needed water. She wrapped herself in her coat and the blanket and stepped out. The town of Silver Creek was waking up. Smoke rose from chimneys, and men were shoveling the boardwalks. As Eleanor made her way to the community well in the center of town, she noticed the change in the atmosphere immediately. The day before, people had looked at her with disdain or lust. Today they looked at her with confusion and a hint of fear. Mrs. Higgins was sweeping the porch of the inn. She stopped when she saw Eleanor approaching, her jaw dropping slightly. She had clearly expected to hear that the city girl had frozen to death in the night. Seeing Eleanor alive, walking with a renewed strength, seemed to offend her. "Still here?" Mrs. Higgins sneered, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thought the frost would have finished you." "I'm made of sterner stuff than you imagine," Eleanor replied, her voice cool. She lowered her bucket into the well. "Don't get comfortable," a man shouted from the blacksmith's shop nearby. "That shack belongs to the county. Sheriff will run you off soon enough." "Actually," a deep, raspy voice interrupted. The crowd that had begun to form turned. It was the old man who had directed Eleanor to the shack the night before. He was staring at something near the edge of the woods, back toward Eleanor's shack. "Look at the wood," the old man said, pointing. Everyone turned to look. From the center of town, one could see the porch of the Miller shack, and more importantly, One could see the massive stack of timber that had been left outside, unable to fit indoors. It wasn't the jagged, scavenged wood of a desperate woman. It was split with surgical precision. "That's Thorn's cut," the blacksmith whispered, his face losing color. "I'd know that axe work anywhere, clean through the knot. Nobody swings like that but the bear." A ripple of unease went through the group. They looked from the shack to Eleanor, and then up toward the looming peak of Blackwood Ridge. "He came down," Mrs. Higgins whispered, clutching her broom. "Silas Thorn came down to town. He hasn't stepped foot past the tree line in 3 years. "He didn't just come down," the old man said, looking at Eleanor with wide eyes. "He brought her supplies. I saw the tracks, deep ones." Eleanor hauled her water bucket up, straining against the weight. She looked at the faces of the townspeople. They were terrified. The mere mention of the man who had saved her reduced these hard, cruel people to whispering children. "Who is he?" Eleanor asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Who is Silas Thorn?" The blacksmith stepped forward, wiping his soot-stained hands on his apron. He looked at Eleanor as if she were a ghost or a witch. "He's the man who owns the mountain, miss, and everything on it, including the ground you're standing on. We just pay him rent to exist." "And," Mrs. Higgins added, a malicious glint returning to her eye, "they say he killed the last woman who went up there, snapped her neck like a twig because she touched his things." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. She thought of the giant in the clearing, the axe in his hand, the silence. He hadn't snapped her neck. He had given her fire. "Why would he help me?" Eleanor asked, more to herself than them. "Maybe he's fattening you up," a miner laughed nervously, though no one joined in. Eleanor ignored them. She picked up her bucket and walked back toward her shack. Her mind was racing. She was an outcast in a town that hated her, living in a shack that wasn't hers, surviving on charity from a man everyone claimed was a monster. She looked up at the mountain, hidden now by swirling clouds. She owed him. She was a Vance, and Vances paid their debts. She didn't know what a millionaire lumberjack recluse could possibly want from a disgraced socialite, but she was going to find out. She would not be a charity case. If she was going to stay in this frozen hell, she needed an ally. And it seemed the only ally available was the monster on the ridge. As she closed the door to her shack, shutting out the wind, she made a decision. Tomorrow she wouldn't just scavenge for survival. Tomorrow she would climb the mountain. She would look the beast in the eye and thank him. She had no idea that climbing that path would set in motion a chain of events that would expose secrets buried for a decade, destroy the peace Silas Thorn had fought so hard to maintain, and turn the quiet town of Silver Creek into a battlefield. The city girl was going to war, and she had just found her weapon. The rejection came not with a shout, but with the quiet, devastating click of a deadbolt sliding into place. Eleanor stood on the porch of the general store, the freezing wind whipping her skirts around her ankles, staring at the sign that had been flipped to "closed" the moment her boots touched the wooden steps. Through the frosted glass, she could see Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, standing behind his counter, arms crossed, staring pointedly at the wall. Beside him, Mrs. Higgins whispered something, her eyes darting toward Eleanor with a mixture of triumph and malice. The message was clear. Silver Creek was closing its doors to the Scarlet Woman. Eleanor knocked, a sharp, desperate rap against the peeling paint. "Mr. Henderson, please. I have money. I only need flour and kerosene." There was no answer, just the muffled sound of laughter from the back room. Eleanor stepped back, her breath hitching in her throat. The supplies Silas Thorn, the man they called the Bear, had left her were dwindling. She had rationed the venison and potatoes with the discipline of a soldier, but the cold demanded fuel. Her body burned calories just trying to stay warm in the drafty Miller shack. Without more kerosene, she would be sitting in the dark by 4 in the afternoon. Without flour, she had no bread. She walked down the boardwalk head high, refusing to let them see her crumble. She tried the blacksmith for coal. He claimed he was out of stock, even as a pile of fresh anthracite sat visible behind his forge. She tried the livery stable to buy a horse or a mule, thinking she might ride to the next town. The stable hand spat on the ground near her hem and told her all the beasts were lame. By the time she returned to the shack, the reality of her situation had settled in her stomach like a stone. This was a siege. The town didn't have the courage to lynch her or drive her out by force, so they were going to starve her out. They wanted her to pack her trunk and crawl back to the stagecoach, to disappear into the oblivion they believed she deserved. "I will not," she whispered to the empty, freezing room. "I will not give them the satisfaction." Her eyes fell on the mountain. Blackwood Ridge loomed over the settlement, a jagged tooth of granite and pine piercing the grey sky. Somewhere up there, amidst the clouds and the snow, lived the only person who had shown her kindness. The town feared him. They said he was a monster. But monsters destroyed. Silas Thorne had provided. If the town wouldn't sell to her, she had to find another way to survive. She looked at her hands, soft manicured hands that were now chapped and red. She had no trade goods. She had no influence here, but she had skills. She had been raised to run a household of 12 servants, to plan galas for hundreds, to manage inventories and budgets. She knew how to turn chaos into order. And from what she had seen of the giant in the woods, chaos was likely his natural state. She packed a small satchel with the last of the venison jerky and a canteen of water. She wrapped her feet in strips of cloth before pulling on her boots, adding layers of insulation against the snow. Then she began the climb. The trail to Thorne's cabin wasn't a road. It was a scar in the earth, barely wide enough for a wagon, winding steeply up the mountainside. The snow here was deeper, untouched by the boots of townsfolk who dared not venture this high. Eleanor trudged upward, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. The air grew thinner, crisper, smelling of ozone and pine resin. Every step was a battle. Her heavy wool skirt, soaked with snow, dragged behind her like a lead weight. Her muscles, accustomed to needlepoint and piano lessons, screamed in protest. But she pushed on, driven by a fury that was hotter than the cold. She thought of her ex-fiancé, drinking champagne in New York while she froze. She thought of Mrs. Higgins's sneer. She fueled her ascent with pure, unadulterated spite. It took 4 hours. By the time the trees thinned and the plateau opened up, Eleanor's legs were trembling so violently she could barely stand. But the sight before her stole what little breath she had left. The cabin, if one could call it that, was immense. It was a sprawling structure of massive, rough-hewn logs, dark with age and weather. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to withstand the apocalypse. A stone chimney, wide enough to drive a carriage through, belched thick white smoke into the sky. To the side, a large barn stood silent, and mountains of timber were stacked with mathematical precision. But the area directly around the cabin was a disaster. Tools were scattered in the snow, rusting. A broken wagon wheel leaned against the porch. The carcasses of traps hung haphazardly from the eaves. It was the home of a man who worked himself to the bone but had no time or care for the softness of living. Eleanor straightened her coat, smoothed her hair as best she could, and marched to the heavy oak door. She didn't knock. She pounded. Silence. Then heavy, thundering footsteps that vibrated the floorboards beneath her feet. The door swung open, and there he was. In the daylight, Silas Thorne was even more imposing. He filled the doorway completely, blocking out the light from the interior. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and scarred from years of labor. His face, hidden behind the beard, was a mask of irritation. He looked down at her, his dark eyes narrowing. He didn't speak. He just waited. "Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I am Eleanor Vance. You left supplies at my door." Silas grunted, a low rumble in his chest. He made a move to close the door. "Wait!" Eleanor jammed her boot into the gap. It was a foolish move. He could have crushed her foot without trying, but he stopped. "I am not here for charity. The town has cut me off. They won't sell me food. They won't sell me fuel. They intend to starve me." Silas stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a second she thought she saw a flash of anger in his eyes, not at her but at the news. But it vanished quickly, replaced by cold indifference. "Not my problem," he rasped. His voice was like grinding stones, deep, unused, harsh. "It is your problem if you have a conscience," she retorted, desperate. "But I am not asking for a handout. I am proposing a trade." He raised a thick eyebrow. "You have nothing I want." "I have order," she said, gesturing to the chaos on his porch. "Look at this. You live like Like a bear, just as they say. You work all day. You likely eat poorly. Your clothes are mended badly, if at all. Your home is undoubtedly a mess. Silas crossed his massive arms. I survive. Survival is not living, Eleanor countered. I can cook. Real food, not just charred meat. I can mend. I can clean. I can manage this fortress. I will be your housekeeper. In exchange, you give me room and board, and protection from the town until the winter breaks and I can leave. Silas let out a sharp, incredulous huff of air that might have been a laugh. You? A city bird? You'd break a nail and faint. I climbed your mountain in 3 feet of snow, didn't I? Eleanor snapped, her eyes flashing. I am standing here while the men in that town are too terrified to even look up at this ridge. Do not mistake refinement for weakness, Mr. Thorne. They stared at each other for a long, tense moment. The wind howled around the corner of the cabin, blowing snow into the entryway. Eleanor didn't shiver. She held his gaze, demanding to be seen. Silas looked at her boot, still wedged in his doorframe. He looked at her determined jaw. He looked at the exhaustion etched into her pale face. He needed help. He knew that. The harvest season was brutal, and he was losing weight because he was too tired to cook properly after 16 hours of felling trees. His cabin was falling into disrepair because there weren't enough hours in the day. 1 week, he grunted finally. If you complain, you go back down. If you slack off, you go back down. If you pry into my business, you go back down. Eleanor exhaled, her knees nearly buckling with relief. Agreed. He stepped back, opening the door fully. Wipe your feet. Eleanor stepped over the threshold and into the lion's den. The interior was cavernous. The main room was dominated by a fireplace that could roast an entire ox. The furniture was oversized, built by hand from whole logs. But she was right. It was a disaster. Dust coated every surface. Dirty dishes were piled on a table that looked like it cost more than the mayor's house. Clothes were draped over chairs. The floor hadn't seen a broom in months. It smelled of stale grease, sawdust, and loneliness. There's a spare room in the back, Silas said, pointing to a dark hallway. Used to be storage. Clear it out if you want to sleep. I will, Eleanor said, removing her coat. She didn't wait for permission. She walked to the pile of dishes, picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet that was caked with old fat, and turned to him. Where is the water pump? Silas watched her, a strange expression crossing his face. He had expected her to ask for tea or a chair or to cry. Instead, she was already working. Outside, round the back, don't freeze the pipes, he muttered. I wouldn't dream of it, she said. Dinner will be at 6. I assume you have something in the larder other than venison. Root cellar, under the trapdoor in the kitchen. Good. Now go cut your wood, Mr. Thorne. You're in my way. Silas Thorne, the giant who terrified grown men with a glare, stood there for a moment, blinked, and then turned around and walked out of his own house, leaving the small woman in the silk dress standing amidst the wreckage of his solitude. As he picked up his axe outside, he shook his head. He had just made a terrible mistake, or perhaps the best one of his life. The transition from the Miller shack to the fortress on Blackwood Ridge was not merely a change of address. It was an entry into a different world, governed by different laws of physics and endurance. Eleanor's first night in the cabin was a sleepless vigil against the strange noises of the mountain, the shifting of the massive logs as the temperature dropped, the shriek of wind through the eaves, and the rhythmic distant snoring of the giant down the hall. Her room was small, a monastic cell compared to the cavernous main hall. She had spent the first 4 hours of her tenancy clearing out crates of rusted nails, old trapping gear, and stacks of yellowed newspapers to make space for her trunk. The bed was a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress that smelled of sweet hay and cedar. It was hard, but it was dry, and the heavy buffalo robe Silas had thrown at her earlier proved to be warmer than any down comforter she had owned in New York. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the slam of the front door. Eleanor jerked awake. The cabin was freezing. The fire in the great hearth had died down to embers. She fumbled for her wrapper, shivering as her feet hit the ice-cold floorboards. She found the main room empty. Silas was gone. A pot of coffee, black as tar and thick enough to chew, sat on the cast-iron stove. Beside it was a note scrawled in charcoal on a piece of scrap wood. Don't touch the desk. Eleanor looked at the desk in the corner. It was a massive roll-top piece, oak buried under a chaotic mountain of ledgers, loose papers, and maps. It seemed out of place in the rustic cabin, a piece of administrative seriousness amidst the wilderness living. She ignored it for now. She had a job to do. The next 3 days were a blur of grueling physical labor. Eleanor attacked the cabin with the same ferocity the town had directed at her. She found a bucket, a block of harsh lye soap, and a scrub brush with stiff bristles. She got on her hands and knees and scrubbed the floorboards until the grey layer of grime vanished, revealing the rich, honey-colored pine beneath. She washed the windows, scraping away years of soot until the sunlight actually touched the interior of the room. The culture shock was brutal. In New York, water came from a tap, hot and ready. Here, water had to be pumped by hand outside in sub-zero temperatures, hauled inside in heavy buckets, and heated on the stove. Using the outhouse was an ordeal that required mental preparation and layers of clothing. There was no electricity, only the maintenance of kerosene lamps and the constant demanding hunger of the fireplace. But there was a rhythm to it, a satisfying primitive logic. You work, you eat, you sleep. There was no time for scandal, no time to worry about what the newspapers were saying. Silas remained a ghost in his own home. He would leave before dawn and return after dark, covered in sawdust and snow, smelling of hard labor. The first few dinners were exercises in awkwardness. Eleanor would set the table, not with fine china, but she arranged the tin plates and mismatched cutlery with geometric precision. She cooked stews, hearty breads, and roasted vegetables. Using herbs she found dried in the pantry to mask the repetitive flavor of the game meat. Silas would enter, wash his hands in a basin by the door, and sit. He ate with the speed and efficiency of a starving animal, barely chewing, eyes fixed on his plate. "Is the stew to your liking?" Eleanor asked on the third night, the silence becoming oppressive. Silas paused, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. He looked at her. "It's hot." "It has flavor, Mr. Thorne. Rosemary and thyme. I found them in the back of the cupboard." "It's food," he grunted, and continued eating. But he took a second helping, and a third. And when he finished, he didn't immediately retreat to his room or the barn as he usually did. He sat back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and watched her clear the table. "You cleaned the windows," he observed. It wasn't a question. "I did." It was like living in a cave. "Sunlight is good for the constitution. Shows the dust," he muttered. "There is no dust," Eleanor corrected him sharply. "I removed that too." A flicker of amusement, or perhaps respect, crossed his eyes. It was gone in an instant, but Eleanor saw it. The dynamic shifted subtly on the 5th day. Eleanor was struggling with the heavy iron latch of the root cellar trapdoor. It was stuck, swollen from the damp. She was pulling with all her might, her face red with exertion, muttering unladylike curses she had picked up from the stagecoach driver. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. A massive hand reached down, grabbed the iron ring, and lifted the heavy oak door as if it were made of balsa wood. Eleanor looked up, startled. Silas was standing there, holding the door open with one hand. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the mechanism. "Hinge is rusted," he said. "I gathered that," Eleanor panted, brushing her hair out of her eyes. "Go get your potatoes." She scrambled down the ladder, retrieved the sack, and climbed back up. As soon as she was clear, he lowered the door gently. He didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked to his tool bench. 10 minutes later, while she was peeling the potatoes, she heard the screech of metal on metal, then the smell of oil. He was fixing the hinge. He spent an hour taking it apart, filing down the rust, greasing it, and reattaching it. When he was done, he opened and closed the door with the tip of his boot. It moved silently, effortlessly. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask for thanks. He just fixed it and went back outside to chop wood. Eleanor touched the smooth metal of the latch, a strange warmth spreading in her chest. It was a language she was beginning to understand. He didn't speak in compliments. He spoke in acts of service. The extra log on the fire before she woke up so the room wouldn't be freezing. The way he started leaving his muddy boots by the door instead of tracking slush across her clean floor. But the mystery of Silas Thorne only deepened. One afternoon, while he was away, Eleanor needed paper to line the pantry shelves. She glanced at the forbidden roll-top desk. The chaos there was maddening to her orderly mind. Just a peek, she told herself, just to see if there is scrap paper. She approached the desk. The papers weren't just random scribbles. She saw blueprints, detailed engineering schematics for bridges and trestles. She saw letters with letterheads from Denver, Chicago, and San Francisco. One letter, partially visible under a ledger, caught her eye. It was from the Union Pacific Railroad. Regarding the timber contract for the western expansion, the terms you dictated are steep, Mr. Thorne, but given the quality of the Blackwood yield, the board has agreed to the price of... Eleanor gasped. The figure mentioned was staggering. It was more money than her father had made in a lifetime. This man, this recluse, living in a log cabin wearing flannel and eating stew, was negotiating directly with the biggest railroad tycoons in America. And he wasn't just a supplier, he was dictating terms. She stepped back, her heart racing. The town thought he was a hermit squatter. They thought he was a brute who cut trees for pennies. They had no idea. He was sitting on a gold mine of timber, and he had the business acumen to exploit it. Why hide it? Why live like this? That evening, the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind shrieked like a banshee, shaking the solid logs of the cabin. Dinner was a quiet affair, the tension of the weather seeping into the room. "Storm's bad," Silas said, breaking the silence. It was the first time he had initiated conversation. "Drifts will be 10 feet deep by morning. Pass is closed." "Then I suppose I am stuck here," Eleanor said, sipping her tea. "Suppose you are." Silas looked at her. The firelight caught the angles of his face, softening the harsh lines. "You used paprika in the potatoes." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "I did. I found a tin in the back." "My mother used paprika," he said softly. The mention of a family, of a past, hung in the air. "She must have been a good cook," Eleanor ventured. "She was a survivor," Silas corrected. "Like you." Eleanor froze. It was the first compliment he had paid her, a real one. "I am not a survivor, Silas," she said, using his first name for the first time. "I am simply adaptable." "Same thing." He stood up, his chair scraping the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the swirling white darkness. His massive frame seemed less like a threat now, and more like a barrier between her and the cruel world outside. "Get some sleep, Eleanor. The wind keeps the wolves awake, but the walls are thick." He turned and looked at her, and for a fleeting second the bear was gone. There was just a man, lonely, burdened, and perhaps for the first time in years, glad that he wasn't alone in the storm. Eleanor went to her room, but she didn't sleep immediately. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind, thinking about railroad contracts and rusted hinges. She realized with a jolt that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. The town was wrong. He wasn't a monster. He was a fortress with the drawbridge pulled up, and somehow she had slipped inside the walls. Outside, the snow piled higher, sealing them off from the rest of the world. The isolation was absolute. But for the first time since leaving New York, Eleanor Vance didn't feel lost. She felt found. The blizzard did not merely arrive, it assaulted the mountain with the fury of a vengeful god. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming wall of white that buried the windows and piled snow against the heavy oak door until the drifts reached the eaves. The cabin, for all its mass and solidity, felt like a small wooden ship adrift in a violent frozen ocean. Inside, the isolation was absolute. The rhythmic routine of the previous week was shattered, replaced by a forced, intimate confinement that stripped away the pretenses of employer and employee. There was no escape to the barn, no retreat to the woods. There was only the fire, the howling wind, and the two of them circling each other in the dim, flickering light. On the second night, the temperature plummeted so drastically that the frost began to creep across the floorboards, reaching toward the hearth like skeletal fingers. Silas dragged the heavy bear-hide rug closer to the fire, gesturing for Eleanor to sit. "The bedroom is too cold," he rumbled, tossing a thick log into the flames. "Sleep here tonight, unless you want to freeze to death out of stubbornness." Eleanor didn't argue. She sat on the rug, wrapping a wool shawl around her shoulders, watching the flames dance. The silence between them was heavy, but it was no longer the awkward silence of strangers. It was the charged silence of two people carrying heavy burdens, trapped in a space too small to hide them. Silas sat in his massive armchair, whittling a piece of pine with a small knife. The shavings curled onto the floor. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from an unmarked bottle. "Whiskey," he said, sliding a glass across the floorboards toward her. "Medicinal. Thins the blood, warms the spirit." Eleanor picked it up. She was accustomed to sherry or champagne, not the rough spirits of the frontier. She took a sip and coughed as the liquid burned a path down her throat, but the warmth that bloomed in her stomach was welcome. "It tastes like fire and wood smoke," she gasped, wiping her eyes. "It tastes like the truth," Silas murmured, taking a long pull from his own glass. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You scream in your sleep, Eleanor." Eleanor froze, the glass halfway to her lips. She lowered it slowly, feeling a flush of shame rise up her neck. I apologize. I didn't know." "You say a name," Silas continued, his voice devoid of judgment, merely stating a fact. "Arthur." The name hung in the air, a ghost summoned by the storm. Eleanor looked down at her hands that were no longer soft, but calloused from the scrub brush and the cold. The whiskey had loosened the tight knot in her chest, just enough for the pain to spill over. He was supposed to be my husband," Eleanor whispered. The wind howled outside, a perfect accompaniment to the memory. "He was charming, handsome, a partner at his father's investment firm in Manhattan. I thought he was the sun and the moon." Silas didn't speak. He stopped whittling, giving her his full attention. "He was also a gambler," she continued, her voice gaining strength fueled by the bitterness. "He lost thousands. When the auditors came, he needed a scapegoat. Who better than his fiancée, who had access to his office? He forged my signature on the transfer documents. He told the police. He told the press that I was a temptress who seduced him to steal his fortune." She laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. "Me, a thief. My family, my parents, my friends. They all turned their backs. To avoid scandal, they said. 'Go west, Eleanor. Disappear, Eleanor.' So I ran. I ran until I hit the mountains and couldn't run anymore." She looked up at Silas, defying him to judge her as the town had. "So there you have it, Mr. Thorne. You are harboring a fugitive, a disgraced woman." Silas held her gaze for a long time. Then he leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "They are fools." "Excuse me?" "A man who blames a woman for his own weakness is not a man," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous intensity. "And a family that abandons their own blood for the sake of reputation." He spat into the fire, the spittle hissing as it hit the logs. "They are worth less than the dirt on my boots." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the shock of being believed. "The town believes the stories. Mrs. Higgins called me a—" "The town," Silas interrupted, "is a collection of sheep led by wolves. They fear what they don't understand. They fear you because you are beautiful and educated, and you don't bow your head. They fear me because I am big and I am silent." "Why do you stay up here, Silas?" Eleanor asked, emboldened by the whiskey and the intimacy of the moment. "You could live anywhere. Why this isolation? Why let them call you a monster?" Silas turned his face slightly, the firelight illuminating the right side of his jaw. For the first time, Eleanor noticed a faint, jagged line running from his ear down into his beard, a scar, old and deep. "I was born in this cabin," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that competed with the wind. "My father was a prospector. My mother was native, Ute." Eleanor's eyes widened. That explained his complexion, the dark richness of his hair. In the territory, such a heritage was often met with violence and prejudice. "When I was 10, a fever took my father. The town, the good Christians of Silver Creek, they came for the land. They said a squaw had no rights to the claim. They tried to burn us out." He touched the scar on his face absent-mindedly. "I got this pulling my mother from the fire. We survived, but she never recovered from the smoke. She died that winter." He looked at his massive hands, turning them over. I grew fast and I grew angry. I took an axe and I cleared the land. I built this cabin over the ashes of the old one. I claimed this mountain not by law, but by force. When I walked into town, they saw a giant, a half-breed, a monster. I let them see it. Fear is a better fence than barbed wire, Eleanor. Fear keeps them off my land. Fear gives me peace." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the lonely, wounded boy hiding inside the fortress of muscle and rage. Her heart broke for him, and in that breaking, something new was forged. A bond. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. His skin was hot, his muscles tense as steel cables. He flinched slightly, not used to a gentle touch, but he didn't pull away. "We are quite a pair, aren't we?" she whispered. "The thief and the monster." Silas looked down at her hand, small and pale against his dark skin. He turned his hand over and engulfed hers, his grip gentle, surprisingly tender. "Let the storm howl," he said softly. "Let the town rot. In here, we are just Eleanor and Silas." They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the storm raging impotently against the walls. That night, Eleanor slept on the rug, wrapped in furs, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of Arthur or the police. She dreamt of pine forests and a giant who stood between her and the cold. The storm broke on the fourth morning. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor woke to a light so bright it pierced through the cracks in the shutters, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The wind had died. The world was still. She sat up, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. Silas was already gone. The heavy front door was unbarred, and a path had been shoveled through the wall of snow that blocked the exit. Eleanor dressed quickly and stepped outside. The world had been transformed. The unsightly debris of the yard, the rusted tools, the broken wheels, was buried under 5 feet of pristine, glittering white. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue. The air was crisp enough to snap in her lungs. She found Silas near the barn, digging out the sled. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their dynamic from the night before, but he didn't stop working. "I need to check the timber stands," he said. "The weight of this snow snaps pines like matchsticks. I'll be gone until dusk." "I'll have a roast ready," Eleanor promised. As he trekked off on snowshoes, disappearing into the tree line, Eleanor returned to the cabin. The confinement was over, but the curiosity that had been gnawing at her during the storm had only intensified. Silas's story about his past explained his isolation, but it didn't explain the contradictions she saw every day. A poor hermit did not have a larder stocked with Kona coffee. A simple lumberjack did not speak with the vocabulary of a university professor, even if he tried to hide it behind grunts. And a man who hated the world did not maintain a roll-top desk that looked like the command center of a general. She walked to the desk. The charcoal warning, "Don't touch the desk," had been wiped away days ago. She felt a twinge of guilt, remembering the vulnerability he had shown her by the fire. But her need to understand him, to know who she was truly living with, was overpowering. She rolled the top up. The chaos she had seen before was, upon closer inspection, a controlled chaos. The stacks of paper were organized by date and region. She began to sift through them, her hands trembling slightly. There were receipts, hundreds of them, not for flour or nails, but for industrial equipment, steam engines, sawmill blades imported from Germany, surveying tools from London. She opened a heavy leather-bound ledger. The handwriting inside was precise, elegant, Silas's hand. She ran her finger down the columns. Union Pacific contract, Sector 4 paid. Denver and Rio Grande expansion, timber rights paid. Silver Creek municipal bond interest due $4,000. Eleanor gasped. She flipped the page. Outstanding debts, Silver Creek. Listed there were the names of every prominent business in town, the general store, the livery, the hotel, even the mayor's office. She sat back in the heavy chair, her mind reeling. Silas Thorne didn't just own the mountain, he owned the town. The people who spat on him, the people who refused to sell her food, the people who called him a monster, they were all living on his credit. He held the mortgage to the very buildings they lived in. He wasn't a hermit hiding from the world. He was a landlord watching his tenants from above, allowing them to exist out of, what? Apathy? or a twisted sense of mercy. She closed the ledger and looked at the bookshelf built into the shadows of the corner. She had assumed the books were old almanacs or Bibles. She pulled one down. It was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Next to it, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Then a series of law books, property law, corporate law, contract negotiations. She opened a volume of Shakespeare. The margins were filled with notes in Silas's handwriting, thoughts, critiques, observations. Hell is empty and all the devils are here. He had underlined that passage in The Tempest and written next to it, "The devils are not in the earth, they are in the town square." Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness. The man she thought she knew, the simple, wounded giant, was a mask. Underneath the buffalo coat and the silence was a brilliant, calculating mind. He had built an empire from a shack, managing one of the largest timber fortunes in the territory, all while letting the world believe he was nothing but a savage. Why? Privacy, she realized. Protection. If the world knew he was a millionaire, they wouldn't just shun him, they would hunt him. They would swarm him with lawsuits, false friends, and gold diggers. By playing the beast, he kept the gates closed. She heard the crunch of snow outside. Silas was back early. Eleanor quickly closed the desk, but she didn't move away. She stood there, her hand resting on the smooth oak as the door opened. Silas stomped the snow from his boots. He looked up and saw her standing by the desk. He froze. The air in the room shifted instantly. The intimacy of the storm evaporated, replaced by the sharp, dangerous tension of a secret exposed. He walked into the room, his axe still in his hand, his face unreadable. "I told you not to touch the desk." Eleanor didn't flinch. She felt a surge of adrenaline. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She knew him now. "You own the bank," she said, her voice steady. "You own the general store. You own the inn where Mrs. Higgins refused me a bed." Silas stopped a few feet from her. He placed the axe against the wall with a deliberate clunk. "I hold the paper. Yes. You supply the timber for the Transcontinental Railroad. You are not just a lumberjack, Silas. You are a tycoon." "I am a man who sells wood," he said flatly. "The rest is just paperwork." "It is not just paperwork." Eleanor stepped forward. "You let them treat you like an animal. You let them starve me out. You could have walked into that town and bought the very ground from under their feet, but you chose to let them hate you. Why?" "Because hate is honest," Silas replied, his voice rising. "When they hate me, I know where I stand. If they knew about the money, that if they knew I could buy their lives 10 times over, do you think they would respect me? No. They would fawn. They would lie. They would smile with their teeth while reaching for my pockets. I prefer the spitting to the begging." He loomed over her, his shadow long in the afternoon light. "And now you know. So tell me, Eleanor, does the money change things? Does the monster look more palatable now that you know he sits on a throne of gold?" His eyes were full of a terrible, cynical challenge. He expected her to change. He expected the city girl to suddenly become sweet, to see him as a mark, just like everyone else. Eleanor felt a flash of anger. She walked right up to him, invading his space, forcing him to look down at her. "You think me so shallow?" she hissed. "You think I care about your gold? I care that you lied. I care that you let me think you were suffering when you were merely hiding." She poked him in the chest, her finger hard against the wool of his shirt. "You are a brilliant, stubborn, infuriating man, Silas Thorne. But you are a coward." Silas blinked, taken aback. "A coward?" "Yes. You hide up here with your books and your millions because you are afraid to let anyone see the real you. You let the scar on your face dictate your life. Well, I have scars too, Silas, but I am still standing. I am still trying to live." She turned away from him, walking toward the kitchen. "The roast will be ready in an hour. Wash your hands. And for heaven's sake, put on a clean shirt. You can afford it." Silas stood in the middle of the room, stunned. He looked at the desk, then at the small woman who had just scolded the wealthiest man in the territory as if he were a naughty schoolboy. A strange sensation bloomed in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't suspicion. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in 20 years. He felt seen, and miraculously he hadn't been rejected. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He touched the scar. Then, slowly, a small, crooked smile appeared in the thicket of his beard. He turned and walked toward the wash basin. The secret was out. The walls were breached. But for the first time, Silas Thorne didn't want to rebuild them. The arrival of spring in the Colorado Territory did not come with a gentle whisper of green, but with the violent, cracking roar of the thaw. The ice that had choked Blackwood Ridge for months began to groan and shatter, sending torrents of meltwater cascading down the granite cliffs. The silence of winter was replaced by the constant, rhythmic dripping of eaves and the rushing of swollen creeks. For Eleanor Vance, the melting snow felt less like a liberation and more like the drawing back of a protective curtain. The white walls that had hidden her and Silas from the world were dissolving into mud, reopening the path to Silver Creek. Inside the cabin, the dynamic had shifted into a comfortable, unspoken partnership. Eleanor no longer feared the giant. She managed him. She organized his ledgers, cooked meals that actually contained nutrients and, much to Silas's grumbling annoyance, forced him to trim his beard into something resembling civilized grooming. In return, Silas taught her how to shoot the heavy Winchester rifle that hung above the mantel and how to identify the tracks of predators. They were an odd pair, the disgraced socialite in mended silk and the millionaire hermit in flannel, existing in a bubble of domestic peace that felt fragile as spun glass. But peace, Eleanor knew, was a commodity her past could not afford. Down in the valley, the mud of Main Street churned under the wheels of a sleek black carriage that looked entirely out of place among the mule wagons and buckboards. The vehicle bore the gilded insignia of a private investigation firm from New York. It stopped in front of the Silver Creek Saloon and a man stepped out. Percival Calloway was a man who wore cruelty like a tailored suit. He was thin, sharp-featured, and possessed eyes that seemed to calculate the price of everything they touched. He adjusted his bowler hat, grimaced at the muck coating his polished boots, and pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The silence inside was immediate. The miners and trappers turned to look at the stranger. Calloway didn't flinch. He walked to the bar, slapped a crisp $10 bill onto the sticky wood, more money than most men in the room made in a month, and turned to face the room. "Gentlemen," Calloway announced, his voice smooth and carrying the distinct nasal drawl of the East Coast elite. "I am looking for a woman, a thief, a liar, a fugitive from justice." He pulled a rolled-up poster from his coat pocket and unfurled it. It was a sketch of Eleanor. It wasn't a flattering likeness. The artist had hardened her features, making her look predatory. "Eleanor Vance," Calloway continued, enjoying the rapt attention. "She seduced a partner at a prestigious Manhattan firm, embezzled $50,000 from a fund designated for war orphans, and fled west." A collective gasp went through the room. The lie was monstrous. $50,000 was an unfathomable fortune. Stealing from orphans was a sin that even the rough men of Silver Creek couldn't abide. "There is a reward," Calloway added, dropping the bait. $500 to the man who leads me to her, and legal immunity for any rough handling that might occur during her apprehension. Mrs. Higgins, who had been wiping tables in the back, stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with vindictive triumph. "I knew it," she spat. "I knew she was the devil in skirts. She's up on the ridge." "With the beast," Calloway raised an eyebrow. "The beast." "Silas Thorne," the blacksmith chimed in, stepping out of the shadows. "Big man, mean. Kills anything that steps on his land. He's harboring her." Calloway smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "Harboring a federal fugitive is a hanging offense. It seems, gentlemen, that we have an opportunity to clean up your mountain and fill your pockets in one afternoon. The mob mentality is a terrifying thing. It doesn't require logic. It requires only a target and permission." Calloway gave them both. Within an hour, the saloon emptied. Men went to their homes and returned with shotguns, pitchforks, and heavy lengths of rope. The fear of Silas Thorne was real, but the greed for the reward and the righteous indignation fueled by Calloway's lies overpowered it. They weren't just a posse, they were a crusade. Up on the ridge, Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. She heard the sound of a jay calling in the distance. Then she heard something else. It was a low, discordant hum rising from the valley floor. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. She walked to the edge of the clearing, looking down the winding trail that was now a muddy scar against the greening mountain. She saw them. A long, dark snake of figures moving up the switchbacks. She saw the glint of sunlight on metal barrels. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the basket of wet linens into the mud. "Silas!" she screamed, turning back toward the cabin. "Silas!" Silas emerged from the barn, a massive timber hook in his hand. He saw the panic in her face and dropped the tool instantly, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "What is it?" "They're coming!" she gasped, pointing down the mountain. "Men! Dozens of them. They have guns." Silas moved to the edge of the ridge. He squinted, his vision sharp as a hawk's. He saw the mob. He saw the man in the black suit leading them. He understood immediately what this was. The world he had kept at bay had finally breached the gates. "Go inside," Silas ordered, his voice dropping to that dangerous, low rumble she hadn't heard since the first night they met. "Bar the door. Load the Winchester." "Silas, no." Eleanor grabbed his arm. Her hands were shaking. "They are coming for me. If I go out, if I surrender, maybe they won't hurt you. I can't let them destroy what you've built." Silas looked down at her. His face was hard, his jaw set like granite, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective intensity. He reached out and cupped her face with one large, calloused hand. "You think I built this for me?" he asked softly. "I built this so I could stand between the world and what matters. Go inside, Eleanor. Do not come out until I say, Silas, go," he roared, the command echoing off the trees. Eleanor turned and ran into the cabin, slamming the heavy oak door and throwing the iron bolt. She grabbed the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. Outside, Silas didn't retreat. He didn't hide. He walked to the center of the clearing, exactly where the trail opened up onto his plateau. He stood there, empty-handed. He didn't pick up his axe, he didn't pick up a weapon. He simply stood, feet planted shoulder-width apart, arms loose at his sides, waiting. The waiting was the worst part. It took 20 minutes for the mob to crest the final rise. They arrived panting, sweating, their boots caked in mud. There were at least 30 of them, miners, drifters, shopkeepers. At the front was Calloway, looking immaculate despite the climb, and the sheriff, a weak-chinned man named Miller, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The mob spilled into the clearing, spreading out in a semicircle. But as they saw Silas, they faltered. Up close, without the safety of the saloon walls, the legend of the bear pressed down on them. Silas was motionless, a statue of judgment carved from the mountain itself. He looked bigger than they remembered, his silence more terrifying than any shout. Calloway stepped forward, tapping a cane against his leg. He looked Silas up and down with a sneer of distaste. "Mr. Thorne, I presume," Calloway said, his voice carrying over the wind. "I am Percival Calloway. I carry a warrant for the arrest of one Eleanor Vance." Silas didn't blink. He stared at Calloway, then let his gaze drift slowly over the faces of the townspeople. He looked at the blacksmith. He looked at Mrs. Higgins's husband. He looked at the stable hand. Under his gaze, men shuffled their feet and lowered their weapons. They felt the weight of something they couldn't name, a shame that burned. "She is a thief," Calloway continued, irritated by the silence. "She stole from orphans. She is hiding in your cabin. Hand her over and we will leave you to your primitive existence. Refuse, and the law authorizes us to use force." "The law," Silas finally spoke. His voice wasn't a shout, but it resonated deep in the chest, a baritone thunder that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. "You speak of the law on my land?" "Your land ends where the law begins, savage," Calloway spat. "Now bring out the girl." "She is not here," Silas lied, his face a mask of stone. "We know she is," Mrs. Higgins shrieked from the back. "We saw her on the ridge. Don't lie to us, you godless hermit." "Burn him out," someone shouted. "Like we should have done years ago." The mob surged forward a step. The tension snapped. A miner raised his shotgun. Inside the cabin, Eleanor raised the Winchester, tears streaming down her face. She aimed at the man with the shotgun. She would not let them hurt him. She would kill for him, but Silas didn't flinch. He took one step forward, just one, but the violence in that movement was so palpable, so sudden, that the entire front row of the mob recoiled. "The first man who steps onto my porch," Silas said, his voice calm, "will not walk off this mountain." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Calloway laughed. "You are 1 man against 30. Do the math, you fool." "I am not doing math," Silas said. "I am giving you a chance to leave with your lives." "Take him," Calloway ordered. 3 men charged. They were rough brawlers, used to saloon fights. They expected a lumberjack, slow and clumsy. They met a hurricane. Silas moved with a speed that defied physics. He caught the first man's shotgun barrel in one hand, ripped it from his grasp, and used the stock to sweep the legs of the second man. The third man swung a club. Silas caught his wrist, twisted it with a sickening crunch, and shoved him backward into the others. It took 5 seconds. 3 men were on the ground, groaning. Silas hadn't even breathed hard. He tossed the confiscated shotgun into the snowbank. "Who's next?" Silas asked. The mob froze. The reality of violence was very different from the idea of it. Calloway's face turned purple. He pulled a revolver from his coat. "Enough of this! I'll shoot you down like the dog you are!" He leveled the gun at Silas's chest. "No!" Eleanor screamed. She threw open the door and ran onto the porch, the rifle in her hands. "Stop! I'm here! Don't shoot him!" The sight of Eleanor froze the scene. She stood on the porch, wind whipping her hair, the heavy gun shaking in her hands. She looked wild and beautiful and terrified. "Excellent," Calloway smiled, thumbing the hammer of his revolver. "The rat comes out of the hole." He aimed the gun away from Silas and pointed it at Eleanor. "Drop the rifle, Miss Vance, or I will put a bullet in your champion here." Silas turned his head slowly to look at Eleanor. His eyes were wide with fear, not for himself, but for her. "Eleanor, go back inside. I won't let you die for me," she sobbed. "So touching," Calloway mocked. "Now, Sheriff, arrest her." The sheriff stepped forward nervously, handcuffs dangling. The mob began to close in again, emboldened by the gun in Calloway's hand. They smelled blood. They sensed the end. But they had forgotten one thing. They thought they were fighting a man who cut trees. They didn't know they were fighting the man who owned the mortgage on the very jail the sheriff was planning to put Eleanor in. Silas looked at the gun pointed at Eleanor. Something inside him broke. The wall he had built around his secret identity, the dam holding back his authority, shattered. He straightened up to his full height. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke next, the raspy voice of the hermit was gone. In its place was the booming, articulate, commanding voice of a titan of industry. "Sheriff Miller," Silas bellowed. The authority in his tone was so absolute that the sheriff stopped dead in his tracks. "If you take one more step, you will be unemployed before the sun sets." The sheriff blinked, confused. "What?" Silas turned his eyes to the mob, his gaze sweeping over them like a searchlight. "And you, Mr. Henderson," he pointed to the owner of the general store, "your loan is past due. I have been lenient. Step on my porch, and I foreclose tomorrow." The crowd murmured. Confusion rippled through them. How did he know that? Silas turned to Calloway. He ignored the gun. He walked straight toward it. "Hand you," Silas said, walking until the barrel of the revolver was pressing against his chest. "Mr. Calloway, Pinkerton Agency, New York branch, license number 492. You are operating outside your jurisdiction. You have no warrant valid in this territory." Calloway's hand trembled. I have rights." "You have nothing," Silas hissed, his face inches from the investigators. "You are trespassing. You are threatening a citizen with a deadly weapon, and you are annoying me." Silas reached up, wrapped his hand around the barrel of the gun and twisted. The sound of metal bending is a unique, nauseating screech. It is a sound that shouldn't happen, a violation of the nature of steel. As Silas Thorne twisted the revolver in Percival Calloway's hand, the barrel didn't just bend, it crumpled. The mechanism snapped. The trigger guard collapsed. Calloway shrieked and dropped the ruined weapon, clutching his fingers. He stared at the twisted lump of metal in the snow, his brain unable to process the physical strength required to do such a thing. Silas kicked the gun away. He didn't strike Calloway. He didn't need to. He simply looked down at him with the disdain of a king looking at a court jester. "Assault with a deadly weapon," Silas recited, his voice crisp and educated, echoing off the cabin walls. "Attempted kidnapping, incitement to riot, trespassing. By the statutes of the Colorado Territory, I am within my rights to shoot you where you stand." He turned to the mob. They were silent now, their mouths hanging open. The beast was quoting law statutes. The hermit was speaking with the diction of a senator. "Mr. Henderson," Silas addressed the store owner again, "you owe the bank $4,000. The note is held by the Blackwood Trust. Who do you think manages that trust?" Henderson turned pale, his pitchfork wavering. I don't know." "I do," Silas said. "Mr. Higgins," he looked at the innkeeper's husband, "your roof was repaired last autumn. You paid with a check from the rail company for lodging their surveyors. Who do you think approves those checks?" Higgins swallowed hard, taking a step back. "You?" "Me," Silas said simply. "Every beam in your houses, every loan in your bank, every contract that keeps your miserable town from becoming a ghost town, it all crosses my desk." He gestured to the cabin behind him. "You call me a monster. You call me a savage, but for 10 years I've kept your economy afloat. I have delayed your foreclosures. I've kept the railroad interested in this valley. And how do you repay me?" He pointed a shaking finger at the mob. "You bring a lynch mob to my door. You threaten a woman under my protection." "She's a thief," Calloway sputtered, cradling his hand, trying to regain control of the narrative. "She stole from orphans." "Lies," Silas retorted instantly. "I have read the police reports from New York. I have had my solicitors look into the indictment." Eleanor, still standing on the porch, gasped. He had. When? Eleanor Vance was framed by Arthur Sterling to cover his own gambling debts, Silas announced to the crowd. "There is no missing money from the orphan fund. It was moved to Sterling's private account. The documentation proves it." You can't know that," Calloway stammered. "Those files are sealed." "Nothing is sealed when you have enough money to buy the wax," Silas said coldly. "I knew who she was the moment she stepped on this mountain, and I know who you are, Calloway. A fixer, a hired thug with a cheap suit." Silas took a step toward the sheriff. "Miller, arrest this man for assault and trespassing, or hand me your badge." The sheriff looked at Calloway, then at Silas. He looked at the ruined gun in the snow. He looked at the terrified faces of the townspeople, who were suddenly realizing that their landlord was standing in front of them, and he was furious. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Calloway, you're under arrest." "What?" Calloway screamed. "You can't be serious. He's bluffing. He's a lumberjack living in a shack." "This shack," Silas interrupted, his voice dripping with irony, "sits on land titled to the Thorne Estate, which comprises 40,000 acres of prime timber. I am not a lumberjack, Mr. Calloway. I am the lumber industry." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. The whispers started immediately. "Thorne Estate? The millionaire from Denver? He was here the whole time? Oh God, the mortgage!" The anger in the crowd evaporated, replaced instantly by a terrified, servile panic. Men dropped their clubs. Hats were snatched off heads and held against chests. Mrs. Higgins tried to hide behind her husband. Silas walked back to the porch steps. He didn't look at the townspeople. He looked at Eleanor. She was trembling, the rifle lowered, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time all over again. He walked up the steps and gently took the rifle from her hands. "It's over," he whispered. He turned back to the crowd one last time. "Get off my mountain, all of you, and if anyone looks at Miss Vance with anything other than absolute respect, their credit in Silver Creek is terminated, permanently." "Yes, Mr. Thorne, Mr. Henderson mumbled. "Sorry, Mr. Thorne," the blacksmith muttered. The sheriff grabbed Calloway by the collar. The investigator was still protesting, shouting about lawyers and lawsuits, but the sheriff dragged him away. The mob dispersed, retreating down the trail with their heads hung low, scurrying like cockroaches exposed to the light. Silas watched them go until the last man disappeared into the trees. Only then did his shoulders slump. The adrenaline faded, leaving him exhausted. He turned to Eleanor. She was leaning against the doorframe, her face pale. "You knew," she whispered. "You checked on me." "After the storm," Silas admitted. I sent a telegram to my lawyers in New York. I needed to know if you were safe to keep, if you were truly a criminal. And when you found out I was innocent, I started building your defense, he said. I was waiting for the right time to use it. I didn't expect them to come so soon. Eleanor looked at the twisted gun in the snow. Then she looked at the man who had just dismantled a lynch mob with words and a squeeze of his hand. You defended me, she said, her voice catching. You exposed yourself, your secret. You gave it all up for me. The secret was a shield, Silas said, stepping closer to her. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His hand was shaking slightly now. But shields are heavy, Eleanor, and I'm tired of hiding. They will never leave you alone now, she said sadly. They know you are rich. They will come begging. Let them come, Silas said, a hard light returning to his eyes. I have something worth fighting for now. I'm not just guarding a pile of gold anymore. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. I'm guarding you. Eleanor let out a sob and threw herself into his arms. Silas caught her, burying his face in her hair, holding her tight against the buffalo coat. For years he had been the bear of Blackwood Ridge, a creature of solitude and silence, but as he held the woman who had climbed his mountain and cleaned his windows and challenged his soul, he knew that the bear was dead. Silas Thorne had returned to the world, and the world was not ready for him. The retreat of the lynch mob left a silence on Blackwood Ridge that was heavier than the storm had been. It was not the peaceful silence of nature, but the vacuum left after a detonation. Eleanor stood on the porch, the Winchester rifle leaning against the doorframe, watching Silas Thorne. The man who had just dismantled the town's hierarchy with a few sentences was now staring at his hands, the same hands that had twisted a revolver into scrap metal as if they belonged to a stranger. You really own it all? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold realization of the magnitude of his secret. Silas turned, the ghost of the bear flickering in and out of his expression. The timber rights were the beginning. The railroad needed wood. I provided it. They paid in stock, not cash. I reinvested. Land, bonds, mortgages. He sighed, a sound that seemed to rattle deep in his chest. It accumulates, Eleanor. Money is like snow. Once it starts sticking, it creates an avalanche. And Arthur? She pressed. My ex-fiancé. You said you built a defense. I did more than that, Silas said, his eyes hardening. I summoned him. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. You brought him here. The board of the Union Pacific is arriving in Silver Creek tomorrow at noon to renegotiate the Western Supply contract. It is the biggest contract in the territory. Arthur Sterling sits on that board. He thinks he is coming to squeeze a backwoods lumberjack for a better price. He doesn't know the lumberjack is the majority shareholder of the bank that holds his own debts. Silas walked past her, entering the cabin. He moved to the bedroom, the heavy thud of his boots echoing on the floorboards he had kept polished for years. When he emerged 10 minutes later, Eleanor gasped. The flannel shirt and buffalo coat were gone. In their place, Silas wore a suit of charcoal wool, tailored to perfection to fit his massive frame. It was clearly expensive, the kind of garment seen in the boardrooms of Wall Street, not in a log cabin at 10,000 feet. He had trimmed his beard, revealing the strong, square line of his jaw and the jagged scar that now looked less like a disfigurement and more like a dueling mark of a warrior king. He looked terrifying. He looked magnificent. We are going to town, Eleanor, he said, extending an arm. It is time you stopped hiding, and it is time I stopped pretending. The journey down the mountain the next morning was a funeral procession for the old order of Silver Creek. Silas hitched the team to the buckboard wagon. He refused the carriage, preferring to drive himself, and helped Eleanor onto the seat. She wore her best dress, cleaned and pressed, her head held high. As they rolled into town, the atmosphere was electric with anxiety. The streets had been swept. The mud was covered with fresh straw. But the eyes watching from behind curtains and storefronts were wide with fear. The monster was coming down, and he was wearing a suit that cost more than their homes. They stopped in front of the Silver Creek Hotel. A private train car had been detached at the station overnight, and a group of men in top hats and long coats were gathering on the hotel porch. In the center of them, laughing loudly and smoking a cigar, was Arthur Sterling. Seeing him again was like a physical blow to Eleanor. He looked exactly the same, handsome, polished, and utterly soulless. He was holding court, gesturing with his cigar, lightly telling a story about his own brilliance. Silas helped Eleanor down from the wagon. He didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate, crushing gravity of a glacier. He took Eleanor's arm and walked her up the steps of the hotel. The conversation on the porch died instantly. The railroad executives turned, expecting perhaps a rough foreman. Instead, they saw a giant of a man who radiated power, with a woman on his arm who looked like a queen in exile. Arthur Sterling froze. The cigar fell from his fingers, rolling across the wooden planks. His face went the color of old ash. "Eleanor?" he choked out. You're alive?" "Hello, Arthur," Eleanor said. Her voice was cool, steady, stripping away months of fear. "You seem disappointed." Arthur stammered, looking from her to Silas. "I was told. I heard rumors of a fugitive—" "Mr. Sterling," Silas interrupted. His voice was a baritone rumble that vibrated in the chests of every man present. "I am Silas Thorne. We have a meeting." The lead executive, a portly man named Mr. Vanderbilt, a distant cousin of the famous Commodore, stepped forward, eyes wide. "Thorne? You are the Thorne of Blackwood Ridge. But the correspondence, we assumed you assumed I was a savage," Silas finished for him. "Shall we go inside? The wind is changing." They entered the hotel dining room, which had been converted into a makeshift boardroom. Mrs. Higgins was serving coffee, her hands shaking so badly the cups rattled in their saucers. She refused to make eye contact with Eleanor. Silas took the seat at the head of the table. He didn't sit. He occupied the space. Eleanor sat to his right. Arthur Sterling, sweating profusely, sat at the far end. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Silas began, opening a leather portfolio he had brought. "You want the timber rights for the Nevada expansion. You want the price to remain at the 1885 levels." "That is the standard rate," Vanderbilt said, trying to regain composure. "The standard rate applies to standard wood," Silas countered. "My timber is kiln-dried old-growth pine. It does not rot. It does not warp. And as of this morning, the price has doubled." "Doubled?" Arthur exploded, finding his voice. "This is extortion. We can find wood elsewhere." "Where?" Silas asked calmly. "I own the rights to the Northern Valley. I own the rights to the Southern Pass. And through my holding company in Denver, I recently acquired the majority stake in the hauling line you use to transport your freight." The room went dead silent. The executives exchanged horrified glances. They weren't dealing with a lumberjack. They were dealing with a monopoly. "But that is not the only business we have today," Silas continued, turning his dark gaze onto Arthur. "There is the matter of the Blackwood Trust." Arthur loosened his collar. I'm not familiar with it." "You should be," Silas said. "You borrowed $50,000 from it 3 months ago, using the collateral of your firm's orphan fund." Arthur stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is preposterous. I am a partner at Sterling & Sons. I don't borrow from backwater trusts." "You do when you have gambling debts in Atlantic City," Silas said, pulling a document from his portfolio. "This is the transfer order, signed by you, and this—" he pulled out another paper, "is the affidavit from your clerk, admitting that he forged Miss Vance's signature on the withdrawal slips under your instruction." Silas slid the papers down the long table. They came to rest in front of Vanderbilt. The executive picked them up, read them, and his face turned crimson. He looked at Arthur with absolute disgust. "Arthur," Vanderbilt said, his voice icy, "is this true?" "It's a forgery!" Arthur screamed, pointing at Eleanor. "She's the thief. She seduced this mountain man to protect her. She's a witch." "Sit down," Silas said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The command hit Arthur like a hammer. The man collapsed back into his chair. "I have already wired the district attorney in New York," Silas stated, "and I have sent copies of these documents to the press. The scandal of Eleanor Vance is over. The scandal of Arthur Sterling has just begun." Silas stood up. He walked down the length of the table until he stood behind Arthur. He placed one massive hand on the man's shoulder. Arthur whimpered. "You tried to destroy her," Silas whispered, leaning down. You took her name. You took her home. You sent men to hunt her like an animal on my mountain. Silas squeezed. Just a fraction of his strength. Arthur cried out in pain. If I ever see you in the Colorado Territory again, Silas said, I will not call the lawyers. I will not call the sheriff. I will find you myself. Do you understand? Yes, Arthur sobbed. Yes, God, yes! Silas released him. Get out! Arthur Sterling, the golden boy of Manhattan, scrambled from the room, fleeing the hotel and the town, leaving his dignity and his career in ruins on the floor. Silas turned back to the stunned executives. Now, he said, smoothing his lapel, about that timber price, I believe we said double. Eleanor watched him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. He had vindicated her. He had destroyed her tormentor, but more than that, he had claimed his place in the world. He was no longer hiding. As they left the hotel an hour later, the contract signed, the town of Silver Creek was waiting. They weren't a mob this time. They stood on the boardwalks, hats in hands, silent and respectful. Silas stopped on the stairs. He looked at the town that had scorned him for a decade. He looked at Mrs. Higgins peeking through the window. He looked at the sheriff. Eleanor, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, would you like to dine at the hotel, or shall we go home? Eleanor looked at the townspeople. She saw their fear, but she also saw their shame. She realized that she didn't need their approval anymore. She had the mountain. She had the victory. Let's go home, Silas, she said, taking his arm. The air is better up there. Silas smiled, a genuine broad smile that transformed his face. He helped her into the wagon, and together the giant and the city girl drove out of Silver Creek, leaving the town to whisper about the day the bear became a king. The spring turned into summer, bringing a riot of wildflowers to Blackwood Ridge. The stark, monochromatic world of white and grey exploded into purples, yellows, and deep greens. The air, once biting and hostile, was now sweet with the scent of pine sap and blooming columbine. Life at the cabin had changed, yet remained fundamentally the same. Silas still chopped wood. He claimed it cleared his mind better than any boardroom meeting, but the desperate edge of survival was gone. The cabin was being expanded. Carpenters from Denver, vetted and silent, were adding a wing for a library and a proper kitchen with indoor plumbing. Eleanor sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and violet. She was sewing, but not for survival. She was mending a tear in Silas's work shirt, a simple domestic task that gave her immense satisfaction. She heard the heavy tread of his boots on the porch steps. Silas sat down beside her, not on the bench, but on the top step, resting his back against the railing. He looked out over the valley. The schoolhouse foundation was poured today, he said. And the teacher? Eleanor asked. Hired. A young woman from Boston. She starts in September. Silas picked up a piece of straw and twirled it in his fingers. Mrs. Higgins came by the site. She brought a pie. Eleanor laughed softly. A pie? From the woman who wanted me to freeze in the street? It was a blueberry pie, Silas noted dryly. She asked if Mrs. Thorne might be interested in judging the Harvest Festival Preserves contest this year. Mrs. Thorne. Eleanor tested the words on her tongue. They hadn't married yet. The chaos of the legal battles, the railroad contracts, and the vindication of her name had consumed the last few months. They lived together in a propriety that confused the town, but suited them perfectly. They were partners first, lovers in spirit, waiting for the dust to settle. It has a ring to it, Silas mumbled. Eleanor stopped sewing. She looked at the back of his head, his dark hair curling over his collar. Is that a proposal, Silas? Silas turned to look at her. The scar on his face was fully visible in the twilight, but Eleanor didn't see it anymore. She only saw the man who had carried firewood to her door when the world wanted her dead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a piece of velvet. He handed it to her. Eleanor unwrapped it. It wasn't a diamond. It was a ring carved from the heart of an ancient ironwood tree, polished until it shone like dark marble, inlaid with a thin band of pure gold. Gold he had likely panned himself from the creek years ago. It was strong, beautiful, and utterly unique. I could have bought you a diamond from Tiffany's, Silas said quietly. I could have bought you the Hope diamond if it were for sale. But that is cold stone. This is living wood. It grew on this mountain. It survived the storms. It's stubborn. Like you, Eleanor whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Like us, Silas corrected. He reached out and took her hand. I don't know how to be a society husband, Eleanor. I hate parties. I hate small talk. I will likely embarrass you at the opera. I hate the opera, Eleanor said, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. And I have had enough small talk to last a lifetime. I want peace, Silas. I want this mountain. Then you have it, he said, and you have me. For as long as the trees stand. He leaned up and kissed her. It wasn't the tentative kiss of their first romance, nor the desperate kiss of the crisis. It was a kiss of belonging, a seal on a contract that no lawyer could ever break. The wedding took place a month later, not in the Grand Cathedral of Denver, but in the small wooden church of Silver Creek. The entire town attended, not out of fear this time, but out of a strange, newfound pride. They had claimed the bear as their own now. He was their local legend, their protector, their tycoon. Eleanor walked down the aisle wearing a dress of cream lace, ordered from Paris but altered by her own hands. She carried a bouquet of mountain wildflowers. When she reached the altar, Silas was waiting. He looked uncomfortable in his suit, shifting his weight, but when he saw her, his stillness returned. He looked at her as if she were the only source of light in the room. When they emerged from the church as man and wife, the town cheered. It was a ragged, raucous sound, far removed from the polite applause of New York society, and Eleanor loved it. In the years that followed, Silver Creek transformed. The Thorne Foundation built a hospital that served the entire county. The school became the envy of the territory. The mud streets were paved, but the greatest change was on the mountain itself. Silas and Eleanor didn't move to a mansion in the city. They stayed on the ridge. They raised 3 children there, children who knew how to speak Latin and how to track an elk, who knew the value of $1 and the value of a cord of wood. Silas continued to run his empire, but he did it from his roll-top desk, overlooking the valley. He never completely lost his gruffness. He still terrified new railroad executives who came to negotiate, but the town knew the truth now. They knew that if you were in trouble, if the winter was too hard, if the sickness came, you didn't go to the mayor. You went to the ridge. One winter evening, years later, a blizzard struck that rivaled the one that had brought them together. Eleanor stood at the window of the expanded cabin, watching the snow swirl against the glass. Her hair was streaked with gray now, and her hands showed the marks of a life fully lived. Silas came up behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her, resting his chin on her head. He was slower now, the old injuries aching in the cold, but his grip was as solid as ever. "The pass is closed," he rumbled, the vibration familiar and comforting against her back. "Good," Eleanor replied, leaning into him. "Let the world stay out there. I have everything I need right here." She looked at the reflection in the glass, the giant and the city girl, the monster and the thief, the husband and the wife. They had found peace not by fleeing the storm, but by building a shelter that could withstand it. And on Blackwood Ridge, amidst the snow and the silence, the fire burned bright, a beacon for anyone lost in the dark, signaling that even in the wildest places, one could find a home.